The room was deathly quiet. The only sound was the steady tick of the grandfather clock, like a heartbeat echoing through the grand, empty space. He lay there on the plush carpet, perfectly still, eyes closed, arms sprawled as if the world had finally taken him down. A millionaire, the kind who thought he could bend life to his will with just a snap of his fingers, pretending to be unconscious. It was a game he had orchestrated, a test to see who feared him, who obeyed him, and who would crumble under the weight of his imagined fragility. He had tried this before with servants, with assistants, with family members. The results were always the same: panic, hesitation, subservience. But today, he wanted to see it one more time. Perhaps it would amuse him. Perhaps it would remind him how absolute his control was. The soft click of polished shoes broke the silence. She appeared in the doorway, carrying a silver tray with a steaming cup of tea balanced carefully in her hands. A black woman, quiet, composed, her posture humble but firm, her eyes, sharp and discerning, flicked to the figure on the floor. For a moment, her step faltered. She paused, breathing in, her gaze assessing the scene with careful attention. Most would have screamed, dropped the tray, or rushed forward in panic. But not her. She didn't flinch. She didn't hesitate. She knelt beside him, placing the tray on a nearby table with a careful hand, her brow furrowed in genuine concern. "Sir, are you all right?" she asked softly, her voice carrying a calmness that seemed almost daring in its steadiness. Her words were careful, measured, respectful, but there was a firmness beneath the gentleness, a subtle declaration that she would not be manipulated. Not today, not ever. He didn't respond. Of course he didn't. He was testing her. This was his little performance, and he imagined how she would react. He had played this scene countless times in his mind. He pictured her eyes widening in terror, her hands trembling, her body shrinking under the weight of fear. He imagined her crawling toward him, begging for instruction, seeking guidance in the man who wielded wealth like a weapon. But nothing of the sort happened. Instead, she looked at him, really looked with a clarity he wasn't expecting. A quiet defiance rested in the line of her jaw. She didn't speak again for a moment, only studied him with a calm, unwavering gaze. Then, in a voice so soft it almost felt like a whisper, she said, "If you're testing me, I don't respond to games, sir." It was a simple sentence, no more than 7 words, yet it hit him harder than any insult, any glare, any public humiliation he had ever endured. It was not defiance born from arrogance or aggression. It was a defiance rooted in self-respect, a refusal to be toyed with. In that instant, he realized that he had underestimated her. She was different from the rest. She had the rare ability to see through his facade, to recognize the games he played, and to meet him without fear or awe. The room suddenly felt smaller, heavier, as if the air itself had thickened around them. Every tick of the grandfather clock became sharper, more insistent, a reminder that time was passing and that this moment, this test, was not going according to plan. The millionaire's heart began to race, a strange thrill mingling with the irritation that he had not anticipated. Curiosity gnawed at him. Was this woman immune to fear? Was this quiet dignity more powerful than any wealth he could ever muster? She straightened slowly, placing her hands firmly on the edge of the table, her posture unwavering. Her eyes never left him. And in that silence, he felt the first crack in his carefully constructed world. Power, he realized, was not absolute. It was an illusion that could be shattered with a single act of courage, a single refusal to bend. And here it was, right before him, in the form of a woman he had never truly noticed until now. For a long moment, they simply stared at one another. The millionaire, lying there, heart hammer in his chest, and the maid, standing composed, a model of quiet strength. He wanted to speak, to regain some measure of control, to reassert his authority. But the words wouldn't come. Pride battled with astonishment, with a dawning respect he wasn't prepared to acknowledge. His mind raced, calculating, rethinking, wondering how he had been so blind all this time. She moved then, but only slightly, adjusting the tray she had placed on the table. Her movements were deliberate, unhurried, as if she had all the time in the world and nothing to fear. She bent down to place a napkin beside the cup of tea, and in the faint light, he could see the calm confidence in every gesture, the ordinary grace of her hands, the quiet power and the simplicity of her actions stunned him. He tried again, feigning a cough, a slight twitch, a deeper groan. He wanted to see her crack, to test whether she truly had the nerve to stand so firmly against him. But she only looked at him, her eyes steady, almost amused, though she hid it well. There was no panic, no flinch, no hesitation. Only presence. Only awareness. She had seen the game for what it was, and refused to play. He felt an unfamiliar twinge of admiration. It was a feeling that made his chest tighten, made his thoughts scatter. He had never faced anyone like this. No one had ever held their ground against him without fear. The walls of his ego, the towers built on wealth and control, suddenly seemed fragile, fragile as glass in her presence. And that single whispered sentence, "If you're testing me, I don't respond to games, sir," echoed in his mind like a bell, resonating deeper than he cared to admit. For the first time in a long while, he felt vulnerable, not physically. He could defend himself by anyone into submission, summon any number of people to obey his commands. No, this vulnerability was different. It was emotional, moral, a reckoning he hadn't expected. Dignity, he realized, spoke louder than money. Respect was earned, not demanded. Fear could not be commanded, and authority could crumble without the foundation of humanity. He stayed still, heart racing, listening not just to the soft and the heating, the faint creak of the floorboards, but to the quiet pulse of awareness that emanated from her. He waited, eyes half closed, ears straining, unsure what would come next. Would she speak? Would she act? Would she break the spell of silence he had tried so hard to create? And then it happened. A sound. Not loud, not dramatic, but precise. A word, a sigh, a movement. Something entirely unexpected that cut through the tension like a knife. His body froze. His mind skipped a beat. Whatever he had imagined, whatever control he thought he wielded, it was gone. This was not the reaction he had calculated, nor the fear he had anticipated. It was something else entirely. Something that made him doubt, made him question, made him sit up slowly and listen with a mix of fear and fascination. The clock ticked on. The room remained still. But something fundamental had shifted. The millionaire, who had believed he controlled the world, realized in that single moment that he had misjudged the measure of true power. And as he lay there, the tension thick around them, he knew the game had changed, the rules rewritten by someone he had underestimated, someone who refused to bend, who refused to falter, and whose quiet courage had already begun to teach him a lesson he would not soon forget. And in that pregnant silence, as the shadows of the afternoon stretched across the ornate rug, he understood something he had never truly considered. Sometimes the smallest voice, carried with the strongest dignity, could move mountains, even if the person speaking was only a maid in a grand house, standing alone against the weight of the world. The room felt heavier now. The faint hum of the chandelier overhead seemed louder, echoing against the polished walls. The millionaire sat upright on the floor, heart still racing from the earlier exchange. But the feeling was different now. Unease had settled into him, unfamiliar and sharp. He had expected fear, trembling hands, panic in her eyes. What he got instead was something else entirely. Calm, measured, unwavering. Her voice cut through the quiet, soft but piercing. "I know why you do this, sir. You want to see if people fear you. But I see people, not your tests." It was a statement, simple, almost gentle, yet it landed with a force that made him flinch. A hammer blow. He stared at her, feeling a flush creep across his cheeks, burning hotter than any anger he had ever known. No one had ever spoken to him like that. Not a business partner, not a family member, not a servant. And yet here she was, standing like a sentinel in a room that had once been a kingdom under his command. He didn't know whether to speak or retreat. So he did neither. He just watched her, and as she moved, the enormity of her presence grew. She carried on with her chores, not hurried, not flustered, but deliberate. Each motion was precise. Folding a napkin, setting a tray, adjusting the teacup, but entirely human, entirely graceful. She hummed a tune, soft, almost imperceptible, but it carried warmth, A quiet resilience, a strength that came not from wealth or power, but from knowing one's own worth. The millionaire's chest tightened as he realized something he had never admitted to himself. She could see him. She could see through the layers of his wealth, through the walls of arrogance he had built, through the petty games and humiliations he inflicted to remind the world he was untouchable. She knew him for what he truly was. A man played with the lives of those he deemed beneath him, testing their fear as if it were currency. And for the first time, her recognition was not met with obedience or submission. It was met with defiance. Polite, understated defiance, but defiance nonetheless. A part of him wanted to lash out. He had never faced such boldness. His ego, inflated for years by money and influence, demanded that she falter, that she stumble, that she finally break. He imagined her trembling, dropping the tray, stumbling to the floor in fear. And yet she did none of that. Her calmness, her unwavering poise, made him feel smaller than he had ever felt in his life. Unable to resist, he decided to escalate. He lay back on the carpet with a little more drama, groaning, pretending his earlier collapse had left him in deeper distress. He expected a gasp, a scream, frantic hands, the shuffle of feet, panic, anything, but the room remained still. The only sound was the faint ticking of the grandfather clock and the soft hum of her voice. She bent down, lightly placing a hand on his shoulder, and said, almost as if reprimanding a child, "Stop pretending, sir. Your fear is not mine to entertain." He froze. Her words were calm, measured, controlled. There was no tremor, no hesitation. The authority in her voice was quiet, unassuming, yet undeniable. Every servant he had ever commanded, every assistant who had begged for approval, every employee who had cowered under his presence, none had ever dared to speak like that. None had ever dared to resist. And yet here she was, standing in defiance of his power, but without hostility, without anger, without fear. A creeping realization spread through him. It was a pang, sharp, unsettling, like ice on his spine. His superiority, carefully constructed over decades of wealth and manipulation, was cracking. The balance of power he had always assumed was absolute had shifted. And it wasn't just shifted. It had been taken from him without force, without confrontation, simply through the strength of her composure. He watched as she continued her chores, her hands steady, her eyes calm, and he noticed something else. There was no rush, no calculation, no strategy, no attempt to curry favor, no obligation to bow, to smile, to flatter. She acted, simply with dignity. And in that dignity lay a strength he could not overpower, no matter how many zeros sat in his bank account. For the first time, he felt invisible. His presence, his wealth, his control, they did not bend her. They did not sway her. She was fully present, fully aware, fully alive, and he was just a man lying on the carpet, pretending to be fragile. And the thought stung more than any insult, more than any financial loss he had ever faced. He tried again in his mind to rationalize it. Perhaps she was afraid of being fired. Perhaps she was too polite to show her true emotions. Perhaps she simply hadn't realized the stakes. But he knew, deep down, it was none of those things. She had seen through him, seen through his games, and refused to participate. Her strength was not loud or dramatic. It was quiet, unshakable, unbending, and it left him unsettled, exposed, almost naked in the weight of his own arrogance. A long silence stretched between them, the kind that fills a room with tension thick enough to touch. He wanted to speak, to reclaim the air, to reassert some kind of dominance, but his words caught in his throat. Pride battled with a creeping respect he was not ready to admit. He felt like a student, watching a teacher who refused to be impressed, who refused to be controlled, who refused to bow to fear. She paused her humming, glanced at him briefly, and returned to her work. And in that moment, he realized the truth. He had miscalculated. The game was no longer in his hands. The experiment he had carefully designed, the test he had orchestrated, had utterly failed. Not only had it failed, it had revealed something far more valuable and far more dangerous to him. The existence of a force he could not command, a strength he could not buy, a human spirit that respected itself above all else. He thought of all the people he had ever dismissed, all the lies he had manipulated, all the fear he had relied upon, and he felt a pang of shame, a rare, bitter taste of humility. Not because she had bested him in some grand confrontation, but because she had simply been herself. Simple, ordinary, human. And yet her humanity was a weapon more powerful than any money, more commanding than any title, more unassailable than any influence he had ever wielded. His eyes followed her, tracking her every motion, noting the quiet dignity in every gesture, the way she held herself, the calm precision of her steps, the gentle strength in her hands. It was hypnotic, disarming, and profoundly unsettling. He realized, with a shock that made his stomach twist, that he had underestimated her. Not underestimated her talent, not underestimated her efficiency, but underestimated her moral strength, her resolve, her unwillingness to be dominated by fear. And in that realization came a deeper question, one that gnawed at him relentlessly. What had he been missing all these years? How many people had he crushed under the illusion of power? How many lives had he dictated? Dictated not through respect, but through fear. And if she, one person, could stand so firmly, what else had he been blind to? He lay back for a moment, closing his eyes, trying to regain his composure, but the effect lingered. The balance of power had shifted, and though the room appeared the same, though the clock ticked on, and the chandelier sparkled in the sunlight, nothing felt the same. He had been shown in subtle, quiet, undeniable ways that strength comes not from wealth, but from the courage to stand, unshaken, unafraid, fully human. And as he opened his eyes and watched her continue her work, humming softly, serene, resilient, he knew, truly knew, that his world had changed. She had not lifted a finger in anger. She had not raised her voice. She had simply been herself, and in that, she had shattered his illusion. The millionaire sat there, heart pounding, mind racing, filled with a mixture of awe, fear, and a begrudging respect. The quiet strength of one woman had exposed his weakness, revealed his fragility, and challenged everything he thought he knew about power. And in that charged silence, he understood a truth that would linger long after the day ended. Strength is not in intimidation. Control is not in fear. And dignity cannot be bought, commanded, or broken. It can only be earned, and it can only be recognized in those brave enough to own it. Hours passed, yet the room felt suspended in time. The sunlight shifted slowly across the polished floors, dust motes dancing like tiny flames in the golden beams. The millionaire finally moved, the act he had maintained with such calculated precision dissolving as he sat up on the carpet, rubbing his temples. A strange mix of exhaustion, admiration, and humiliation twisted inside him. The pounding in his head was not from the physical act of lying on the floor, but from the recognition that someone had seen through him, stripped away his illusions, and left him bare. He looked at her, the maid, and his voice trembled slightly, uncertain. How do you do that?" She lifted her eyes, steady and unshaken. Calm, measured, a quiet storm contained in a single gaze. "Do what?" she asked, voice soft yet firm. "Stand my ground. Keep my dignity. Not let anyone play with my life like a toy." Her words were simple, but each one landed with precision, like a blade honed on truth. The weight of her stare pinned him in place, reflecting back his arrogance, his ego, every manipulation he had ever attempted. In that moment, he saw himself for what he truly was. Not the man he wanted the world to believe, but a figure trapped behind wealth and power, blinded by the illusions he had built around himself. He felt it then, the shift, a strange stirring in his chest, a tremor of understanding he had never known. For years, he had equated money with control, fear with respect, and authority with admiration. But all of that seemed fragile, almost laughable now, as he watched her move through the room with quiet purpose. Every gesture was deliberate, graceful, human, yet invincible in its simplicity. She had built a fortress of dignity around herself, impervious to his games, his schemes, his theatrics. And the more he watched, the more he realized that he had lived his life in a bubble of illusion, masking emptiness with opulence, masking weakness with intimidation. He wanted to speak, to apologize, to explain, to reclaim some semblance of control. He wanted to bow, to kneel, To show the respect he suddenly felt pressing against the walls of his chest. But pride held him still, a stubborn barrier he could not yet dismantle. So he did what he could. He listened, truly listened. The hum of the chandelier, the faint ticking of the grandfather clock, and the soft rustle of her movements filled the room, forming a rhythm he had never noticed before. And then she spoke again, words so simple yet so profound they cut to the years of arrogance he had carried like armor. You can buy everything, sir, except respect. That comes from how you treat people. The millionaire's world tilted, as if the ground beneath him had shifted imperceptibly but irrevocably. He felt a pressure on his chest, a tightening that forced him to sit straighter. He had always thought the lesson lay in wealth, in cunning and manipulation, but the truth was far simpler, far more human. Respect could not be bought. It could not be feigned. It could only be earned, nurtured through empathy, consideration, and acknowledgement of another's humanity. Her voice, steady and unwavering, had delivered a lesson worth more than any fortune he had accumulated. A lesson that would not fade with time or be silenced by arrogance. For the first time, he examined her fully, beyond the uniform, beyond the polite manners that had once allowed him to dismiss her as ordinary. He saw the strength that came from a life lived with integrity, the resilience forged by hardships he could never imagine, and the calm courage that refused to bow to fear. Each breath she drew seemed deliberate, measured, a testament to the quiet power she possessed. And in the shadows of the room, in the soft light that fell across the polished floors, he realized that this quiet, unassuming woman had shown him more about life, about morality, and about human dignity than he had learned in all his years of wealth and influence. He wanted to laugh, but it was a hollow, nervous sound that caught in his throat. He wanted to speak, but the words seemed trivial compared to the weight of her presence. And yet, even as pride restrained him, a strange gratitude began to seep into his heart. Not the gratitude of obligation or fear, but the kind that comes from understanding a truth too long ignored. He had underestimated her, dismissed her, assumed that power and status could manipulate every situation. But now, he recognized that his assumptions were flawed. He recognized that the strength she possessed was something he could neither command nor purchase, something he could only witness and, perhaps, learn from. He leaned back slightly, trying to process the cascade of emotions that surged through him. Humiliation, yes, but it was tinged with awe. Confusion, yes, but it was laced with clarity. Anger, yes, but it was tempered by insight. She moved past him then, adjusting a teacup, straightening a napkin, her every motion calm, ordinary, yet monumental in its quiet defiance. The ordinary had become extraordinary, and he could not escape the recognition that he had misjudged the measure of true power. His mind wandered over the countless times he had wielded wealth like a weapon, thinking he could bend others to his will, testing, manipulating, asserting dominance. And he realized how hollow those victories had been, how empty, how temporary. All of that paled in comparison to what he saw now: humanity, dignity, courage, real strength, not in the size of his bank account, not in the fear he had once inspired, but in the integrity of her spirit. He wanted to reach out to touch the surface of that strength, to acknowledge it, but he remained still. Movement seemed unnecessary. Words felt inadequate. The silence between them, thick and charged, carried more weight than any speech he could make. And then he understood the subtle beauty of her lesson. Power was not in money. Respect was not in intimidation. Strength was not in cruelty. True influence came from empathy, understanding, and the courage to stand firm, to honor oneself, to see others as fully human. He thought of all the mistakes he had made, the people he had underestimated, the lives he had overlooked, and a new awareness settled over him, uncomfortable yet liberating. He had been blind, and now, for the first time, he could see not just her, but the limitations of his own life, the emptiness behind his pursuits, the illusions he had used to shield himself from truth. And as he absorbed this, he realized that this was not a lesson easily forgotten, not a truth easily dismissed. It would linger. It would shape him. It would demand he act differently, think differently, and, perhaps most terrifyingly, be differently. She paused then, turning slightly, her gaze softening but never losing its clarity. "I hope you understand, sir," she said quietly, almost conversationally, that life is not a game. People are not pieces. And dignity is not negotiable. Her words sank into him like stones into water, creating ripples he could not contain. He felt a shiver run through him. Not from fear, not from weakness, but from the recognition of a moral truth that he had long ignored. The room seemed brighter, sharper, and yet heavier all at once, charged with the gravity of understanding. And he realized that the world he thought he controlled was not as absolute as he had believed. Some things, some truths, were beyond manipulation. Some strengths, like hers, were untouchable. He leaned back against the plush carpet, absorbing the weight of the revelation, the quiet storm of respect and humility that had overtaken him. Pride, which had always been his shield, now felt like a barrier he needed to dismantle. Fear, which had been his tool, now seemed shallow, meaningless. And in that charged moment, he glimpsed the true measure of life. Not wealth, not status, not manipulation, but the courage to stand, the respect to honor, the dignity to uphold. And as he watched her continue with her tasks, ordinary yet extraordinary, he understood, finally, that the revelation was complete. It was not a lesson delivered with anger, not a moral force through punishment, but a quiet truth, radiating from someone he had underestimated. She had shown him what it meant to be human, to be courageous, to be dignified. And in that revelation, he felt something he had rarely known, humility, tempered by awe and the unmistakable stirrings of respect, deep and lasting. By evening, the house had grown quieter. The golden light of the setting sun spilled across the polished floors, casting long shadows that stretched like fingers across the room. The millionaire moved differently now. There was no pretense, no calculated posture, no invisible games meant to test the people around him. He carried trays, steadying them with hands that were no longer trembling from the rush of manufactured tension, but guided by genuine attention. He paused sometimes, listening intently as she spoke, truly listening. The maid's voice had shifted from cautious politeness to a natural rhythm of storytelling, and he absorbed every word. Her tales, simple anecdotes of life, of struggle, of quiet triumph, carried a weight that no fortune could buy. Each word struck him, each pause, each laugh, each sigh a reminder of the humanity he had ignored for so long. He laughed too, not the forced, hollow chuckle of a man trying to charm, but a deep, genuine laugh that surprised even him. It arose from humility, from recognition of how foolish his games had been, from the dawning awareness that he had spent years measuring worth by wealth, influence, and fear. The sound echoed in the high ceilings of the grand house, reverberating against walls lined with art and history, and yet it felt strangely light, as though the very act of laughing stripped away layers of arrogance he had carried like armor. He caught her glance, and for the first time, he saw not a servant, not a subordinate, but a teacher who had shown him more about life than he could ever have learned in boardrooms or ballrooms, more than any fortune could impart. She moved among the furniture, folding napkins, setting teacups, speaking of her small joys and quiet hardships, and he followed her lead, learning the rhythm of her world. It was not laborious, not a performance to entertain, but a demonstration of care, precision, and pride in one's work. He began to understand that true power was not in commanding fear, not in orchestrating scenes to prove dominance, not in seeing others as objects in the game he controlled. True power was in respect, empathy, and recognition. It was in seeing the humanity in another person, acknowledging it, and valuing it above all else. The air in the room felt different now, where before it had been heavy with tension, filled with the weight of ego and the games of the man who believed in his absolute authority. It now carried a quiet warmth. The sunlight flickered across her face as she spoke, and he noticed the subtle strength in her posture, the calm certainty in her gaze. She had not bowed. She had not flinched. She had not allowed herself to be diminished, even by someone with wealth, influence, and carefully honed arrogance. And in doing so, she had imparted a lesson that was impossible to ignore. He carried trays alongside her, awkward at first, fumbling with the weight, his hands betraying his inexperience. But she offered guidance without condescension, corrections delivered gently, her patience unwavering. He realized that wealth alone could not command cooperation. Only respect, only genuine connection could do that. The simple act of following her lead, of performing even the smallest tasks with sincerity and attentiveness, became a revelation. He saw that power without empathy was hollow, authority without understanding was fragile, and wealth without morality was empty. In the quiet of the evening, he reflected on his past, the games he had played, the people he had manipulated, the fear he had cultivated, all seemed petty now. He thought of all the times he had assumed that respect was earned through intimidation, that loyalty could be bought, that fear could substitute for human connection. And he felt a rare, piercing gratitude for the lesson that had been delivered so subtly, so completely, by someone he had once dismissed as inconsequential. She had shown him that the worth of a person was never measured by their station, their wealth, or their obedience, but by the courage to maintain dignity, the resilience to stand firm, and the integrity to act with purpose. He noticed small things now, details he had overlooked in the rush of privilege, the way she arranged the silverware, the careful placement of a napkin, the gentle hum she carried with her movements. All these acts spoke volumes. They were a language of respect, of care, of excellence lived quietly, without fanfare. And he understood finally that these small, deliberate choices held more power than any sum of money, more influence than any boardroom decision, more truth than the wealth he had amassed. By the time evening had deepened into twilight, the millionaire felt a transformation within himself. He had shed the pretense of superiority, the habit of testing, the arrogance that had guided his life for so long. In its place grew a subtle awareness, a moral clarity that made his chest ache with both the weight of shame and the relief of understanding. The maid, once merely a figure beneath him, now occupied a place of profound significance in his mind. She was not a subordinate. She was a teacher, a mirror of what he had failed to see in the world around him and in himself. He followed her into the kitchen as she prepared tea, and they worked in unison, their movements coordinated not by hierarchy, but by mutual recognition. Occasionally, she would glance at him with a knowing smile, and he would nod, understanding that the lesson was complete, yet ongoing. The act of sharing space, of working together, of seeing each other fully, was the truest education he had ever received. His laughter now came unbidden, light and free, mingling with hers, a sound that symbolized the breaking down walls he had long considered permanent. When the night finally came, he stood at the doorway, looking back at the room. The chandeliers cast soft golden light, shadows dancing across polished floors. He carried within him a weight he had never known, not financial, not material, but moral, spiritual, human. A subtle smile curved on his lips, tinged with humility, tinged with recognition. He had lost some pride along the way, but had gained something infinitely more valuable. A moral compass recalibrated by the quiet power of a black maid who refused to bow to fear. He stepped outside, the cool night air brushing his face. The world had not changed, and yet he had. The lesson lingered, etched deeply into his consciousness. Dignity was stronger than deception. Courage was louder than wealth. Respect was earned, never bought. And he knew, as he walked down the long, shadowed driveway, that this understanding would shape every interaction, every decision, every moment of his life henceforth. Wealth alone had never given him such insight. Status alone had never shown him such truth. He thought again of the woman who had taught him this lesson. Her quiet strength, her refusal to be diminished, her dignity in the face of his arrogance. All of it had transformed him. She had not needed to raise her voice. She had not needed to demand anything. She had simply been herself, and in doing so, she had revealed the essence of humanity he had so often overlooked. That revelation, the recognition of true strength and humility, of power and integrity, of influence and kindness, was a gift he would carry forever. As he finally walked into the night, leaving the house behind, he understood that life's true measure was not in riches or schemes, but in integrity, humility, and recognition of others' worth. He had learned that power without empathy was meaningless, that wealth without respect was empty, and that human dignity, once seen and honored, could transform even the hardest hearts. The night air felt different on his skin, lighter somehow, filled with possibility. The moon cast its silver glow across the driveway, And for the first time, he moved forward not as a man testing the world, but as a man transformed by it. And somewhere deep inside, he knew this truth. No game, no manipulation, no fortune could teach what a single act of courage and dignity could. He had lost pride, yes, but he had gained insight. He had shed illusion, yes, but he had embraced truth. And the lesson, the quiet, steadfast, unwavering lesson, would remain with him, shaping every action, guiding every choice, reminding him forever that respect is never bought, only earned, and courage is louder than wealth.